Hello, everyone. When speaking of the greatest military leaders in European history, few names echo as powerfully or leave as profound a mark as Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not merely a strategic genius, a commander endowed with extraordinary intellect and courage, but also a man who reshaped the entire political and social landscape of his era. Born into a poor, noble family on the distant island of Corsica, Napoleon nurtured an unyielding ambition to rise above his circumstances. Within only 6 years of arriving in France as a political exile, penniless and unknown, he ascended to supreme power through a daring military coup. From a young, obscure officer, Napoleon became the man who held the destiny of a nation in his hands. Even as he stepped into the realm of politics, the essence of his character remained that of a soldier, disciplined, resolute, and unbroken in the face of adversity. Napoleon was a strategist by nature, possessing an uncanny intuition for the battlefield and the rare ability to make life-or-death decisions with astonishing precision. He understood the art of war as though it flowed through his very veins, knowing when to strike with lightning speed, when to withdraw with calculated prudence, and above all, how to inspire an army to believe in victory. His military brilliance shone not only in glorious campaigns such as Austerlitz or Jena, but also in his far-reaching vision for the destiny of an entire continent. Yet Napoleon's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. He embodied intellect, will, and the restless human drive to create, carrying within him a vision of a powerful France and a reimagined European order built upon the ideals of revolution and progress. Under his rule, France reached the zenith of its glory, becoming the center of power and civilization in Europe, admired by many, yet feared by more. More than 2 centuries later, Napoleon's name continues to ignite endless debate. Some hail him as a heroic genius, a reformer of unmatched brilliance and determination. Others condemn him as the very symbol of boundless ambition and the lust for domination. But whether praised or denounced, one truth endures. Napoleon Bonaparte shook the world and carved an indelible mark into the course of human history. A man who was at once a hero and a legend, and forever a testament to the unconquerable will of humankind against the tides of fate. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in the small town of Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica, in the heart of the Mediterranean Sea. He was the second son of a family with Tuscan roots. His father, Carlo Buonaparte, was a lawyer of minor nobility. The Bonaparte family had settled in Corsica in the 16th century, back when the island still belonged to Italy. Napoleon was born just 1 year after Corsica had been ceded by the Republic of Genoa to France. By birth, he was already a French citizen, a citizen of a great European power that, ironically, was beginning to show signs of decline. As Napoleon himself would later say, "I was born as my nation was dying." When France took control of Corsica in 1768, many locals, led by Pascal Paoli, rose up against the French occupation. Napoleon's father initially joined the rebellion, but after Paoli's defeat and exile to England, Carlo chose to cooperate with the French authorities, believing further resistance was futile. Thanks to his father's noble connections, young Napoleon had opportunities most Corsicans could only dream of. In January 1779, he left his island home for the mainland, enrolling at a religious school in Autun to learn French. By May, he had been accepted into the military academy of Brienne-le-Château. There, the young Corsican boy, with his thick accent and Italian-sounding name, Napoleone di Bonaparte, was mocked by his classmates. But instead of lashing out, he withdrew into his studies. At just 9 years old, he already possessed a steely determination that would define his life. Though not an outstanding student overall, Napoleon excelled in mathematics, history, and geography. One teacher even predicted he would make a fine sailor, yet fate had other plans. In 1784, he was admitted to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, training to become an artillery officer. When his father died the following year, the family's finances collapsed. To support his mother and siblings, Napoleon completed a 2-year program in just 1 year, graduating in September 1785. At 16, he became a second lieutenant in the French artillery. For the next few years, he remained an unremarkable officer. But in 1789, as the French Revolution erupted, everything changed. Napoleon returned to Corsica, torn between loyalty to France and his island's nationalist movement. When Pascal Paoli returned from exile to lead Corsican independence, tensions rose. Paoli viewed the Bonapartes as traitors for having sided with France. Trapped between royalists, revolutionaries, and Corsican separatists, Napoleon threw his support behind the French Revolution, joining the radical Jacobins and earning a lieutenant colonelcy in the Corsican militia. After Corsica broke with France in 1793, Napoleon and his family fled to the mainland. It was there, amid France's political chaos, that destiny called his name. That same year, the southern port city of Toulon rebelled against the French Republic and opened its gates to the British fleet. France's most vital naval base was now in enemy hands. The Republic ordered an immediate counterattack, and Napoleon, thanks to the recommendation of a fellow Corsican, was appointed commander of artillery. At Toulon, his genius began to shine. With limited men, poor equipment, and scarce ammunition, Napoleon improvised, repairing old cannons, training infantry to handle artillery, and building new fortifications. His relentless drive turned a ragtag force into a formidable unit. On December 17, 1793, amid pouring rain and brutal close combat, Napoleon led a daring assault that captured the key fortifications. He was wounded in the thigh, his horse shot from under him. But Toulon fell, the British retreated, and France was saved. At just 24 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte was promoted to brigadier general. France had found its rising star. In the spring of 1796, the air in Paris buzzed with both chaos and ambition. France was still in the grip of revolution, its enemies encircling it on all sides. The Republic, bloodied and weary from years of war, needed a miracle. That miracle came in the form of a 26-year-old general, short in stature, pale in face, but burning with confidence. Napoleon Bonaparte. He had recently married Josephine de Beauharnais, the widow of a guillotined aristocrat and a woman of influence within revolutionary circles. Many saw their union as political convenience. Yet for Napoleon, who adored Josephine passionately, it was also personal. Little did anyone know, days after their wedding, he would leave her behind and ride south, toward destiny. His mission was clear: lead the army of Italy against Austria and its allies. On paper, it was a hopeless assignment. His troops were starving, poorly equipped, and demoralized. Their uniforms were tattered, their boots worn through. But when Napoleon arrived, everything changed. He didn't speak to them like a commander issuing orders. He spoke like a prophet igniting faith. Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. Government owes you much but can give you nothing. Your patience, your courage, honor you, but no glory shines upon you. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." The army roared in response. For the first time in years, they believed, and within days he proved he could deliver. Napoleon's first move was bold and unexpected. Instead of facing Austria's main force head-on, he attacked the Piedmontese army of Sardinia, Austria's ally, splitting their defences apart before they could unite. At Montenotte, Millesimo, and Mondovi, he struck with speed that defied the terrain and the odds. In less than 2 weeks, the Sardinians surrendered. France's southern flank was secure. Napoleon now turned his full force against Austria. Crossing the Alps, he launched a string of brilliant operations, Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli, names that would forever echo in the annals of warfare. At Lodi, his troops hesitated to cross a heavily defended bridge over the Adda River. The Austrian cannons tore through the air like thunder. Napoleon seized a flag, charged to the front, and led the assault himself. Under fire, he forced the crossing, and victory was theirs. It was there that his soldiers began calling him the Little Corporal, a nickname born of affection and awe. He had earned their trust not just as a general, but as one of their own. What made Napoleon different was not merely courage, it was his mind. He saw battlefields like a chessboard, moving divisions as if they were extensions of his own thoughts. His philosophy was simple yet revolutionary. Move fast, strike hard, divide and conquer. He didn't wait for perfect plans. He created momentum and forced the enemy to react. His campaigns became lessons in mobility, deception, and timing, principles that would later define modern warfare. By the end of 1796, the Austrians were in full retreat. Napoleon had captured Milan, liberated Lombardy, and established republics loyal to France across northern Italy. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a statesman in the making. The French government, watching from Paris, was astonished. Their young general was not only winning battles, he was reshaping Europe. In January 1797, the Austrian army made one last desperate attempt to reclaim Italy. Their force of 60,000 men marched south. Napoleon had fewer than half that number, but he had speed, precision, and audacity. At Rivoli, high in the snow-covered hills of northern Italy, Napoleon deployed his troops in a daring trap. Through brilliant maneuvering, he encircled the Austrians from multiple directions. After 2 days of brutal fighting, the enemy collapsed. The field was strewn with thousands of dead and captured soldiers. It was a decisive French victory, the kind that sealed reputations forever. By the spring of 1797, the war in Italy was effectively over. Austria sued for peace, signing the Treaty of Campo Formio, ceding vast territories to France. Napoleon returned home a hero, his name on every lip, his face printed in every newspaper. But his ambition was only beginning to awaken. He had tasted power and realized that war was not just fought with cannons and cavalry, but with ideas, symbols, and legend. When he rode through the streets of Milan, people threw flowers in his path and called him the liberator of Italy. Yet behind his calm eyes, Napoleon was already thinking beyond Italy, toward the east, toward glory greater than any general before him. By 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte had become a legend across France. His victories in Italy had transformed him from a mere general into a national hero, admired, feared, and envied in equal measure. Yet in Paris, politicians of the Directory grew uneasy. The young general's fame was outshining the government itself. So when Napoleon proposed a daring expedition to Egypt, the Directory seized the opportunity. It was a way to expand French influence and to send their most ambitious general far, far away from the capital. Napoleon's vision, however, went beyond politics. He dreamed of building an empire in the East, striking at British power in India, and rekindling the glory of Alexander the Great. He once wrote to his officers, "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon us." This was not just a military campaign, it was a journey into myth. In May 1798, Napoleon set sail from Toulon with a massive fleet, more than 300 ships, 38,000 soldiers, and, remarkably, a team of 167 scientists, engineers, and artists. This wasn't merely an army, it was a moving civilization. They crossed the Mediterranean under the blazing summer sun, evading the British Navy led by Admiral Horatio Nelson. After weeks at sea, the French fleet reached the coast of Egypt. Napoleon's first battle came at Alexandria, a swift victory. From there, he marched his army toward Cairo, across the burning sands of the desert. The heat was merciless, the wind full of dust, and yet his men followed him, driven by faith in the man who had never been defeated. On July 21, 1798, as the French army approached Cairo, they faced the forces of the Mamluks, elite warriors on horseback, armed with curved swords, shining armor, and the confidence of centuries. The French soldiers, exhausted and outnumbered, looked to Napoleon. He raised his hand and calmly commanded, "Form the squares." Within moments, the French regiments transformed into massive, disciplined blocks of men, bayonets bristling outward, cannons placed in the gaps. The Mamluk cavalry charged with thunderous speed, but the French fire was devastating. Volley after volley tore through their ranks. In less than an hour, the proud Mamluk army was shattered. From that moment, Cairo belonged to France. Napoleon stood before the pyramids, the sun setting behind them, the desert wind whipping his cloak. It was here he felt closest to eternity, where past and future seemed to meet. Unlike other conquerors, Napoleon didn't just bring soldiers, he brought knowledge. He ordered his scientists to study Egypt's monuments, its flora and fauna, its language and history. They founded the Institute of Egypt, and from their work emerged one of humanity's great discoveries, the Rosetta Stone, the key to understanding ancient hieroglyphs. For a moment, Napoleon seemed to embody the Enlightenment itself, a warrior and philosopher combined. He spoke of bringing progress, reason, and modernity to the East. But while he built monuments on land, disaster was approaching from the sea. On August 1, 1798, as Napoleon's army rested in Cairo, Admiral Nelson finally caught up with the French fleet. In Abu Bay, under a blood-red sunset, the Battle of the Nile began. It was chaos. French ships, anchored too close to shore, became easy targets. Nelson's ships attacked from both sides, an unprecedented maneuver. The battle raged through the night, the sea lit by burning vessels. By dawn, almost the entire French fleet was destroyed. Napoleon and his army were stranded in Egypt, cut off from France. Still, he refused to show despair. "We no longer have ships," he said, "but we still have our swords." Despite the defeat at sea, Napoleon pressed on. He conquered Cairo, defeated Ottoman forces, and even launched an ambitious invasion into Syria. But there, at Acre, his luck turned. The city resisted fiercely, British ships supplied the defenders, and disease ravaged his troops. The dream of empire in the East began to fade under the desert sun. In August 1799, sensing France's political turmoil, Napoleon made a bold decision. Leaving his army behind under General Kleber, he secretly sailed back to Europe. evading the British once again. When he arrived in France, the nation was collapsing into chaos. The Directory had lost control, corruption and instability were everywhere, and the people were yearning for a savior. France in 1799 was a nation on the edge. After years of revolution, war, and political chaos, the Directory, the government that ruled France, was collapsing under its own corruption. Inflation soared, enemies gathered at the borders, and the public's faith in the Republic was fading fast. In the streets of Paris, people whispered the same name, Bonaparte. When Napoleon returned from Egypt in October 1799, he found his country desperate for order. He was still young, only 30, but already carried the aura of destiny. Crowds greeted him as a savior, soldiers saluted him with reverence, and politicians saw in him either salvation or the end of their power. Among those politicians were Emmanuel Sieyès and Roger Ducos, men of the Directory who secretly plotted to overthrow it. They needed someone with military strength and popular appeal to legitimize their coup. They needed Napoleon. And Napoleon, ambitious, calculating, always one step ahead, needed them too. The plan was set in motion for November 9th, 1799, known in the revolutionary calendar as 18 Brumaire, Year Ehare. The pretext was simple. A supposed royalist uprising threatened Paris, so the Council of 500, France's legislature, would temporarily relocate to Saint-Cloud, just outside the city. Troops loyal to Napoleon surrounded the area for protection. That morning, the air was thick with tension. Napoleon entered the council chamber, flanked by guards, and began to speak. His voice trembled, not from fear, but fury. He denounced the Directory as corrupt and incapable, claiming he sought only to save the Republic. But as he spoke, chaos erupted. Lawmakers shouted, "Tyrant!" and "Outlaw him!" Fists slammed against desks, and one deputy lunged at him with a dagger. Napoleon stumbled, nearly fainted, and was dragged out by his brother Lucien Bonaparte, who was presiding as president of the assembly. Lucien turned to the soldiers outside and cried, "My brother's life is in danger. The council is full of assassins." The soldiers loyal to Napoleon stormed the hall. Bayonets glinted in the candlelight. Deputies scattered in panic. The Directory was finished. By the next morning, France had a new government. The constitution was rewritten, power concentrated in the hands of 3 consuls. But everyone knew who truly ruled. Napoleon became first consul, Sieyès and Ducos his nominal partners. Yet within weeks, Napoleon had outmaneuvered them both, consolidating power in his own hands. The revolution that had begun with cries of liberty now rested on the will of one man. Still, to the weary citizens of France, he was not a tyrant, he was a savior. He restored order to the streets, discipline to the army, and hope to a nation that had forgotten what stability felt like. He spoke of unity, progress, and greatness. He reformed education, finance, and justice. Under his leadership, France began to transform from a nation torn by revolution into a disciplined, efficient, modern state. Napoleon understood that true power did not come solely from the sword, but from structure, from laws, education, and the trust of the people. He established the Bank of France, stabilizing a currency that had collapsed under years of chaos. Through strict fiscal reform, he restored credit, revived trade, and brought the economy back to life. In education, he created the lycée system, state-run schools designed to train a new generation of administrators, officers, and engineers loyal not to privilege, but to merit. "Knowledge," he once said, "is the true foundation of power." His schools became the backbone of France's new civil service. In law, he achieved his greatest and most lasting triumph: the Napoleonic Code of 1804. It swept away centuries of feudal customs and established the principle that every citizen, noble or peasant, was equal before the law. Property rights were secured, religious freedom protected, and the authority of the state clearly defined. It was justice made rational, revolution made permanent. Nor did he neglect the Church. In 1801, he signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, reconciling Catholic France with Rome after a decade of hostility. The agreement restored peace to the French soul. The Church could worship freely, but it would serve under the authority of the state. Napoleon had learned that faith, too, could be governed. With these reforms, he gave France not merely order, but identity. The revolution had torn the old world down. Napoleon built a new one in its place, one grounded in merit, law, and national pride. To his critics, he was an autocrat. To his supporters, he was the embodiment of progress. The people adored him. The soldiers worshipped him, and the world began to tremble once more. By 1802, Napoleon's power was absolute. A national referendum made him consul for life, a title no Republican had ever held. Paris glittered with prosperity, and yet, in the shadows, his ambition grew restless. He began to dream of empire, of a France not led by a general or a consul, but by an emperor. In May 1804, the Senate declared Napoleon Bonaparte Emperor of the French. On a cold December day, in the grandeur of Notre Dame Cathedral, the coronation took place. The world watched in awe as Napoleon took the golden crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and placed it upon his own head. It was a gesture that said everything. I owe my power to no one. As the trumpets echoed through the cathedral, France entered a new era, the Napoleonic Empire. He was no longer the child of revolution. He was its conqueror. The streets of Paris blazed with light, his armies prepared for war, and his destiny stretched far beyond the borders of France. For now, the world belonged to him. But even the brightest star, no matter how fiercely it burns, eventually meets the darkness of its own making. The year was 1805, and the world trembled at the name Napoleon Bonaparte. From the Atlantic to the Vistula, from the Alps to the Pyrenees, his empire glittered like the midday sun, young, bold, unstoppable. France was no longer just a nation, it was a force of nature, reshaping the map of Europe beneath the will of one man. Napoleon's ambition had outgrown France. He dreamed of a continental order, a Europe united under his control, guided by the ideals of merit and modernity. But old powers do not fade quietly. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, four ancient monarchies, formed a grand alliance to crush the upstart emperor. They believed he could be contained. They had no idea they were about to face one of the most brilliant military minds in human history. In the autumn of 1805, a coalition army of nearly 90,000 Austrians and Russians marched westward into Central Europe. Napoleon moved like lightning. In a matter of weeks, he led his Grande Armée, 200,000 strong, across the Rhine River, cutting the enemy off from their supply lines. At Ulm, he trapped and forced the surrender of an entire Austrian army without a major battle. But the masterpiece was yet to come. On December 2nd, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Austria and Russia near a small Moravian town called Austerlitz. It was dawn. A cold mist hung over the fields. Napoleon's troops feigned weakness, retreating from a hill called the Pratzen Heights, inviting the enemy to occupy it. When they did, he struck like a blade. From behind the fog, French divisions surged upward, splitting the Allied centre in two. The sun broke through the mist, what soldiers would forever call the sun of Austerlitz. By noon, the Allied army was shattered. More than 30,000 of their men lay dead or captured. Napoleon stood on the field, calm, almost serene. "One sharp blow," he said, "and this coalition will crumble." It did. Austria sued for peace within days. Europe had witnessed a new kind of warfare, a symphony of speed, deception, and precision. The world had a new master. In the years that followed, Napoleon's victories became legend. Jena, Friedland, Wagram, each a masterpiece of strategy, each another step in reshaping the continent. He defeated Prussia in a matter of weeks, crushed Austria again, and forced Russia's Tsar Alexander the Fair into alliance at Tilsit in 1807. On a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, the two emperors met face to face, dividing Europe like gods deciding the fate of men. The Treaty of Tilsit made Napoleon's empire the dominant power from Lisbon to Warsaw. He created new kingdoms, placing his brothers and generals on thrones, Joseph in Spain, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia. France was not just conquering territory, it was remaking Europe in Napoleon's image. He reformed the laws, abolished feudalism, spread the Napoleonic Code, and brought modern administration wherever his eagles flew. For millions across Europe, he was both conqueror and reformer, a paradox of steel and vision. But one enemy refused to kneel: Britain. Protected by the sea and its unmatched navy, Britain continued to finance coalitions and blockade French trade. Napoleon responded with his continental system, a massive economic embargo designed to strangle British commerce by closing all European ports under his control. It was an audacious move, but also a fragile one. The system hurt France's allies as much as it did Britain. Smuggling flourished, resentment spread, and cracks began to appear in the empire's foundation. Still, Napoleon pressed on, confident that his genius could outpace every obstacle. He built roads, bridges, and monuments. He reorganized education and government. He turned Paris into the beating heart of the modern world. In portraits and paintings, he appeared serene and invincible, hand tucked in waistcoat, eyes fixed on eternity. But beneath the marble calm, his empire was beginning to strain under its own weight. In 1808, Napoleon made one of his most costly mistakes. Determined to enforce his continental system, he invaded Spain, overthrowing the Bourbon king and placing his brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish people rose in revolt. From the mountains and villages came a new kind of war, guerrilla warfare, brutal, unpredictable, and endless. French soldiers found themselves ambushed, isolated, and hunted. It was a war of attrition that bled the empire dry. Britain seized the opportunity, sending an army under Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, to aid the Spanish resistance. For the first time in years, French invincibility faltered. The Peninsular War would drag on for 6 long years, costing Napoleon hundreds of thousands of men and tarnishing the myth of his invulnerability. Despite the growing cracks, Napoleon's empire reached its peak around 1810. He ruled over 70 million people, commanded the most powerful army on earth, and controlled or influenced nearly every government in Europe. He married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, sealing peace with his former enemy and linking himself to one of Europe's oldest royal families. In 1811, their son was born, Napoleon II, the King of Rome. It seemed the dynasty of Bonaparte was destined to last for centuries. From the outside, the empire glittered with perfection. But inside, ambition had turned to obsession. Napoleon began to believe he was invincible, that his destiny was not of this world. And as history often reminds us, the higher a star climbs, the darker its fall becomes. By the spring of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. He was Emperor of France, King of Italy, Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, Master of Europe from the Pyrenees to the Vistula. But one man refused to obey. Tsar Alexander I of Russia. The Tsar had grown weary of Napoleon's continental system, which strangled Russian trade and suffocated its economy. To Napoleon, this defiance was intolerable. He had bent kings and emperors to his will. How could one man stand apart? Thus he made a fateful decision: to invade Russia. He told his generals, "One good battle, and the Russian Empire will kneel." But Russia was not like the others. It was vast, patient, and merciless. And the campaign that began with glory would end in ashes. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled the greatest military force Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 soldiers from across his empire. French, Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, even Spaniards, all marched under the same banner, the Grande Armée. They crossed the Niemen River on June 24th, stepping onto Russian soil. Drums rolled, flags waved, and Napoleon watched from horseback, convinced that destiny itself was marching beside him. But the enemy did not meet him in battle. The Russians retreated, burning villages, crops, and supplies as they fell back. Napoleon advanced into a wasteland. At first he saw it as weakness. Soon he realized it was a trap. The summer heat scorched the land. Roads turned to dust. The further the army marched, the thinner its ranks grew, men collapsing from hunger, thirst, and disease. The Russians offered only skirmishes, refusing decisive battle. The French captured empty towns, looted stores, and pressed on, deeper into the unknown. Napoleon expected to end the war swiftly, perhaps in a single grand battle. But each day stretched into another, with no victory, no surrender, only silence and smoke. The Grande Armée was marching not toward glory, but into the heart of Russia's vastness. Finally, on September 7th, 1812, the Russians turned to fight near a small village called Borodino, just west of Moscow. It was one of the bloodiest battles in history. More than 250,000 soldiers clashed in a single day of thunder, fire, and slaughter. Cannon fire tore through lines, bayonets met flesh, and smoke covered the fields like nightfall. Napoleon watched from a hillside, ill and exhausted, commanding by instinct rather than inspiration. By evening, the French held the field, but not victory. The Russian army had not broken. It simply withdrew, leaving tens of thousands of dead behind. Napoleon muttered, "The Russians have learned how to fight, but not how to win." He did not realize it was he who had lost the greater battle: time, distance, and the will of his men. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow, the prize of the campaign. But as his troops marched through its silent streets, they found only ruin. The city had been abandoned, and that night fires erupted everywhere, set by the Russians themselves. For days, flames consumed Moscow. Palaces, cathedrals, homes, all burned. The city that should have been his triumph became a tomb of smoke and ash. Napoleon waited for Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. But the Tsar remained silent. Weeks passed, supplies dwindled. Winter crept closer. At last, Napoleon understood. The Russians would rather burn their own land than bow to him. On October 19, 1812, after 5 long weeks in the ruins of Moscow, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. The journey home would become a nightmare that haunts history. Snow began to fall. The temperature plunged below freezing. Horses died in the thousands. Cannons were abandoned. Men wrapped themselves in rags, burning wagons just to stay alive. They were no longer soldiers. They were ghosts. Russian forces harassed the retreating columns day and night, striking like wolves. Frostbite blackened hands and faces. The wounded froze where they fell. Napoleon's proud Grande Armée disintegrated on the endless white plains. By the time they recrossed the Niemen River in December, fewer than 50,000 men remained. The emperor who had conquered Europe stood in silence, staring into the snow, realizing what he had lost. In a single campaign, Napoleon's empire began to crumble. His enemies, Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia, saw their chance. The myth of invincibility was gone. As the survivors limped home, one officer wrote, "We are the remnants of the greatest army the world has ever seen, and the world will never see its like again." Napoleon returned to Paris ahead of his troops, masking the catastrophe with proclamations of victory. But deep down he knew the tide had turned. The empire he built on speed, strategy, and willpower had met the one enemy he could not outmaneuver: the endless frozen patience of Russia. Winter had broken Napoleon's army, but it had not yet broken Napoleon himself. As the shattered remnants of the Grande Armée limped home from Russia, the emperor was already planning his next move. He refused to believe that destiny, his destiny, could end in the snow. In the spring of 1813, while Europe was still reeling from the horror of the Russian campaign, Napoleon raised a new army. France had lost its veterans, its horses, its pride. But Napoleon still had the one thing no one could destroy: his will. He told his marshals, "Victory belongs to the most persevering." And for a brief moment, it seemed he might be right. The young conscripts of France, barely trained, marched east once more. In May 1813, Napoleon won stunning victories at Lutzen and Bautzen, showing that his genius had not faded. But his enemies, now united in a new sixth coalition of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain, had learned his methods. They refused to face him directly. Instead, they struck at his allies, his supply lines, his flanks. Napoleon was fighting not one war, but 4 at once. By October 1813, the decisive moment came near the city of Leipzig. There, over 600,000 soldiers from every corner of Europe converged in what would become known as the Battle of the Nations, the largest battle in history until World War I. For 3 days, cannon fire thundered across the plains. French and Allied troops fought heroically, but the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. When Saxon troops, once Napoleon's allies, turned against him mid-battle, the tide was sealed. On October 19th, Napoleon ordered a retreat. But as his army crossed a bridge over the Elster River, the bridge was blown too soon. Thousands of men were trapped on the far side, drowning, crushed, or captured. It was chaos, an empire collapsing in real time. Napoleon rode west in silence, his cloak heavy with mud and smoke. Behind him, the dream of continental domination burned to ashes. In 1814, the Allies invaded French soil. From the north came the Prussians, from the east the Austrians, from the south the British. Napoleon fought like a lion cornered, winning small battles, Brienne, Montmirail, Champaubert, displaying flashes of his old brilliance. Even his enemies admired him. One Prussian officer wrote, "It is as if he fights against fate itself." But it was hopeless. Paris fell on March 30th, 1814. The Senate, once loyal, turned against him. His marshals, exhausted and disillusioned, begged him to surrender. On April 6th, Napoleon abdicated the throne. He was allowed to keep the title of emperor, but only of the tiny island of Elba off the coast of Italy. And so, the conqueror of Europe was led away in exile, leaving behind a nation that had both worshipped and feared him. As his ship drifted toward the horizon, Napoleon looked back at France and murmured, "They will remember me, not as I am, but as I was." For 10 months, Europe rested, believing the age of Napoleon was over. Kings returned to their thrones, and the victors of the war gathered in Vienna to rebuild the old world. But far away on Elba, Napoleon waited. He read newspapers, studied reports, and learned that France was restless. The restored Bourbon king, Louis XVI, had already lost the people's faith. Taxes rose, soldiers were dismissed, and whispers began once again, "If only the emperor were here." And then, on February 26th, 1815, he made his move. With barely 1,000 men, Napoleon slipped past British patrols and landed on the coast of France. When royal troops were sent to arrest him, he faced them unarmed, opening his coat and shouting, "Soldiers, here I am. If any of you would shoot your emperor, do it now." No one fired. Instead, they cheered. The road to Paris became a triumphal march. Within 3 weeks, Napoleon was emperor again. Europe was stunned. He had returned, not with armies or riches, but with sheer force of will. The Allies moved swiftly. Britain's Duke of Wellington gathered his army in Belgium, while the Prussians advanced under Field Marshal Blücher. Napoleon struck first, hoping to divide and destroy them before they could unite. On June 18, 1815, near a small Belgian village called Waterloo, the final battle began. Rain poured over the fields, turning them into rivers of mud. Napoleon's cannons bogged down, his cavalry charges faltered. For hours he hurled his men against Wellington's iron line, but the British held firm. Late in the day, Napoleon saw movement on the horizon. He thought reinforcements were coming, but it was the Prussian army arriving to seal his fate. By evening, the French lines broke. The Imperial Guard, his most elite troops, made one last stand, shouting, "The Guard dies but does not surrender." And die they did. Napoleon watched from a hill as his empire crumbled before his eyes. The dream that had begun 20 years earlier on the island of Corsica ended here, in the mud of Waterloo. After the battle, Napoleon fled to Paris, hoping to rally the government. But France was finished with war. He abdicated again, this time for good, on June 22, 1815. 2 weeks later, he surrendered to the British. When he asked for asylum, they denied him. Instead, they sent him far, far away, to a lonely rock in the South Atlantic called St. Helena. There, in a small house overlooking the sea, the man who had ruled half the world spent his final years surrounded by silence and memory. He dictated his memoirs, walked the barren hills, and spoke often of glory, destiny, and France. On May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon Bonaparte died. His last words were said to be, "France, army, Josephine." Napoleon Bonaparte died far from home, an emperor without an empire, surrounded by the endless grey sea of St. Helena. Yet even in death, his shadow stretched across continents. History did not bury him, it built itself around him. Napoleon had risen from the chaos of the French Revolution, a young officer who believed in merit, reason, and the power of human will. When Europe trembled before old monarchies and divine rights, he declared that a man could rise by talent alone. Under his rule, the ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, did not vanish. They evolved. He codified them into law through the Napoleonic Code, which swept away feudal privileges and became the foundation of modern legal systems in Europe and beyond, from Belgium and Italy to Latin America and even Japan. To this day, when a citizen stands equal before the law, a faint echo of Napoleon's pen still lingers. Beyond conquest, Napoleon built nations. He modernized administration, established national education, founded the Bank of France, and redefined the relationship between church and state. The systems he forged, civil service exams, centralized governance, public schooling, became blueprints for the modern world. He was not merely a general, he was an engineer of society. And while he crowned himself emperor, he also opened the path for generations of self-made men and women to believe that destiny could be earned, not inherited. But history is never simple. Napoleon's genius came with a price. Millions dead across Europe, nations burned, and families torn apart. He spread progress but also war. He spoke of enlightenment, yet sought domination. For every reformer who praised his vision, there was a mother who cursed his ambition. He freed peoples and enslaved their sons to his endless campaigns. Even now, more than 2 centuries later, historians still debate the question: was he a hero who rebuilt civilization, or a tyrant who devoured it? Perhaps he was both. Perhaps that is what makes him human. When his body was brought back to Paris in 1840, millions lined the streets. Bells tolled, flags draped in black fluttered in the winter wind, and the Seine reflected a city in mourning. The man they had once overthrown was now their eternal symbol. He was laid to rest beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides in a sarcophagus of red quartzite. Even in death, he lay at the center of the nation he had built. On his tomb are carved words that capture the paradox of his life. Here lies Napoleon, emperor and king, who made laws for France and Europe. He had once said, "My true glory is not in having won 40 battles. Waterloo will erase the memory of so many victories, but what will live forever is my civil code." And he was right. Strip away the titles, the crowns, the armies, and what remains? A boy from a small island who dreamed of greatness, a man who saw himself not as a ruler of people, but as an architect of destiny. He was ruthless, brilliant, flawed, and endlessly human. He once confessed, "I love power, but I love it as an artist loves his art, to shape, to create, to give form to the chaos of the world." Perhaps that was his truest calling, not as a conqueror of nations, but as a sculptor of history itself. More than 200 years later, the world he helped forge still bears his fingerprints. Modern Europe, the roads, the laws, the institutions, carries the imprint of his vision. And in every leader who dares to reshape the world by force of will alone, we see a glimmer of him still. He began as a child of revolution. He became the master of empires. He died alone. But he lives forever in the story of humanity's reach for greatness, and in the warning that even the brightest flame, if unrestrained, can consume the world it seeks to illuminate. And that's the end of today's video. If you found it helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Stories and Documents channel. And turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any similar content in the future. Goodbye, and see you next time.